snow was beautiful. Oh, come on. It was pretty when it was coming down. You didn't have to go out in it right away. It is amazing how God's handiwork is involved in creation and how the weather really does affect everything we do in our lives, doesn't it? It controls our schedules, it changes our schedules, it really does allow us to just remember that we are not in control and that there is something greater and larger than us that is in control. So this morning I want to continue with our series on relationships, and this morning we're talking about a different kind of relationship. We're talking about the family. And I don't know, recently, maybe it's just because it's the new year, maybe this is how things kind of work, but statistics start coming out this time of year, don't they? They talk about 2015 and how we did or didn't do and what the trends were and all those kinds of things. And one of the trends that they say is going to happen in 2016 is that more and more people are going to get their hands dirty building their own dream home. More people want to be involved in building their own house. And I personally think that comes out of that HGTV people, right? I mean, it's getting so popular. Fixer Upper and Tiny House and all those great things that we're watching. And we all get excited, flip or flop, I can do that, and we're all jumping in. And they say over the next 12 months there's going to be this record number of people building their own homes. But the reality is that they're not building homes. They're building houses. And I don't have to tell you the difference between a home and a house, do I? I suggest that home building is at an all-time low in our culture. I suggest that there are even fewer homes inside of houses in our world. And I think it's an epidemic. And I think it's something that we need to stop and take stock and evaluate and then to reevaluate and then to refocus ourselves and our energies and to move forward. Because building a family not only carries us forward, but it carries us into generations that follow us. So what does it take to build a home or a family relationship? Well, that's what Mark's gospel is about for us today. Mark tells us about a very unusual event that happened to Jesus. And some of us might have heard the gospel reading this morning and thought, okay, Jesus was teaching. He was in a house teaching. But there's a lot more in this and the interchange that happens with Jesus. See, first of all, he's not very far into his ministry. He's kind of new at this. He's what we call a nouveau riche. He's just newly popular. The paparazzi have just caught on to who he is. And when he rolls into town, word spreads quickly, and all sorts of people start come running. Some people come running just to get something. They want to be healed or changed, or they want their lives to be better. And others come because they want to know his teachings. Others come because they're simply curious. Others come because they're afraid. They're trying to figure out what this guy is doing. And with all of this excitement and this popularity surge, his family becomes worried. His mother and his brothers become very worried. They start to think, our brother might be going a little nuts here. He's just going around spouting stuff off, and he's putting all of us in danger. We need to go get him. And so his mother and his brothers, they show up at the house that Jesus is inside teaching. And they send somebody in to go get him. And so he goes in and he says, hey, Jesus, your mother and your brothers, they're outside, they're looking for you. And Jesus says something that's very profound and yet very odd, which would seem very odd for someone who is filled with love and care to say. Jesus says, who are my mother and my brothers? Can you imagine what that sounded like in his mother's ear? To have the son that you've raised and cared for to turn around and say, well, who's my mother? As if to just diss her that way. And I'm sure those who were seated in the room listening to his teachings probably thought, oh, that's a little strange. That's not the answer we would expect from a devoted son like Jesus. And then Jesus says, who are my mother and my brothers? And he points to all those in the home who have gathered to listen to the teachings. And he says, here Here are my mother and my brother and my sisters. Whoever does God's will is my family. Sounds a little cold, doesn't it? I mean, they're there to help him, and he's just throwing them out and saying no longer is he related to them. Sounds to me like Jesus has some problems in the family, doesn't it? We don't normally think of it that way, though, do we? Because in the Old Testament, we hear lots of stories about families who are having some troubles. All the way back from Genesis with Cain and Abel, there was a murder there. And we move up to Noah and his family. You know, what a mess. We moved up to Jacob and Esau, brothers and mothers who were all in struggle and strife. But not Jesus. Jesus doesn't have problems, does he? He's perfect. But it seems like Jesus has some tension in his family. I think what Mark is trying to tell us today is, take a little slack off yourself. Because all families have problems. All families have challenges. Perhaps even Jesus. As parents, it's very difficult to raise children, isn't it? Amen? Amen. It's a challenge. And there's no rule book, guidebook, there's no kind of an instruction pamphlet that you bring home from the hospital. And so we just try to do the best we can. There's a story of a mom who always, when she took her kids to the grocery store or to the department store, she always warned them not to be running around, don't act crazy, be respectful, because if you run around, you break something, we have to pay for it. She goes to the department store one day with the children, and she goes up to the cosmetic counter, where they have those samples out, right? And so she tries one. She opens it to try a sample, and it breaks. She looks to the left, and she looks to the right, and she puts the lid back on, and she slides it back on the counter. Steps away slowly, and walks away. Continues to do her shopping and picks up some things and gets in that checkout line, and then finally when she's up to the register and they're ringing everything up, her little 7-year-old boy is standing next to her. He shouts out, "Mom, don't forget to pay for the lipstick you broke." Busted. Parenting is not always easy. Being part of a family is not always easy. That's why bringing a family together and having family life pretty much is trial and error, isn't it? We try some things and it works. We try some other things and it doesn't work. I think it's particularly difficult being a family in today's world. In today's world where we have dual income parents and we're split between two different places doing two different things. Today, even, you can go online and pay for a subscription, and they will video your child at daycare so that you can watch them from work. So not only are you working, you're parenting at the same exact time. It's difficult. It's difficult being a family. It's difficult trying to figure it all out. But we're not only stressed in trying to be family, because I'm sure some of you felt that family stress over the last holiday season, when uncles and cousins and nieces and nephews and all those have to get together on one roof and try and figure out how to smile to one another across the table. We're not only filled with the stress, but we're also filled with the guilt. We're filled with tremendous guilt about how our families are or are not acting. Recently in a parenting magazine, they wanted to find out what would parents do differently if they had to do it all over again. If you could go all the way back and knowing what you know today, how would you do it differently? There's 3 themes that came up from this question. And the first one was material possessions. One dad said, I would like to teach my children that you can get by with very little. And that what's most important is what's inside of yourself. We have a lot of stress trying to give our families everything we think they need. The second theme was prioritizing our time a little differently. One mother responded like this. She said, I wish I had spent less time with my vacuum cleaner and more time with my children. And the third theme was this: focused on life goals instead of short-term successes. One mom said, "I wish I had made more room in our lives for spiritual exploration." You know, it's that struggle we have between Sunday school and soccer practice. All families have problems, and Jesus' family seemed to have a problem. And yet we know that God desires us to build a relationship in family. We know it was the most important thing he did. We know because in Genesis, he gave his one and only son a wife. And then he gave the first parents their first child. God created a whole bunch of things, and one of the things that he created for us was a family unit. People coming together like that. He wants us to get our families right. Another thing that we also learned from Mark's gospel this morning is that perhaps family meant something a little different to Jesus. Perhaps it was more than just bloodline. Perhaps it was more than just a gene pool. Perhaps it meant more like commitment and relationship. You know, when Jesus pointed to those people that were gathered in the home and he said, "These people are my mother and my sister and my brother," he was referencing the commitment that they had, that they gathered together to learn and to study and to start exhibiting the godly characters that he was teaching. Those people in that home had really done quite a bit of sacrifice to get there. They weren't at work. And they knew they could be persecuted for being there, for following him and what he was teaching. They stepped out and showed their level of commitment to be there. Jesus said, "Who are my mother and brothers? Here are my mother and my brothers." It was far beyond biology for Jesus. We have something similar today in our families that adopt. Adoptive families today are far beyond biology. And they all seem to have this common theme at some point in their lives. They wonder, what happens when a child starts to ask about biology? What happens when a child starts to ask about what they call natural parents? Now, for many of us, we can't understand how we would be turned to that kind of a question and be able to appreciate that level, but we still must understand what Jesus is telling us. A family is not just blood. A family is commitment to being part of that relationship. He says, your family consists of these persons, and you are part of this family because of your commitment to it. We all know that adoptive parents can be the best parents in the world because of their commitment and their love. We also know, unfortunately, that biological parents, natural parents, can be uncommitted and not show any love and not be part of their child's life. It can be both ways. In a financial trade magazine that was recently published, they were trying to get to the heart of what makes a business person successful. And so they interviewed the top 100 successful business people. They wanted to find out what is it that makes them tick and gives them all their drive. Now, they got down to like the top 10. And they interviewed one gentleman, and he gave his reasoning. He said, reaching the level of business success that I have requires total commitment. Makes sense, right? Total commitment. And he didn't stop there. He kept right on going. He said, if your family is too demanding, then do what I did. Get a new family. He just tossed them out so that he could be committed to something that apparently meant a lot to him. It shows us that family takes commitment, and we can make the decision to not be committed to it. It may sound incredibly selfish the way he said that, and hopefully it is very uncommon for what he said. But it turns out it's not. It happened to be a common theme running through these so-called successful executives. It's also somewhat of a common theme that runs in our families today. We have a lot of disappearing parents in this world. Those who just choose to walk away physically, some do it emotionally. That's why it's so refreshing to hear stories of parents who are committed to their children and to their children's friends and to the neighborhood and to their schools and into their community. James Dobson, he's the founder of something called Focus on the Family. Now, it's exactly what it means. It's a Christian organization that focuses on the family. And he tells this wonderful story of his great-grandfather, George McCluskey. You see, George devoted 1 hour every day of prayer just for his family, just for his children and his children's children. This is what James Dobson has to say about his great-grandfather. He says, "There have been times that I have sat on the platform of a large church waiting to give a sermon or to speak. And there I have felt the presence of my great-grandfather. It staggers my mind to realize that the prayer of this one man, spoken more than 50 years ago, can reach across 4 generations of my family and influence my life right there when I need it most." I don't think any of us would question James's great-grandfather's commitment to his family. It doesn't matter if we're biological or not. What matters is whether or not we're committed to building that relationship. Which is what the last thing that Jesus brings up as he's speaking to these people that are gathered that we heard in Mark's Gospel. He says, whoever does God's will. That's his litmus test. If you want to know what it takes to be a good family member, whoever does God's will. He says, whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. Jesus says good people make good family members. And also people of questionable character, they don't make good family members. Biology or not. There was a gentleman who was quite famous back in the 80s. He turned the economy around at a very large corporation and affected the world in doing so. His name was Lee Iacocca. Mr. Iacocca wrote a book called Straight Talk, and this is what he had to say about his family. He said, "My father told me that the best way to teach is by example. He certainly showed me what it took to be a good person and a good citizen. As the old joke has it, no one ever said on his deathbed, I should have spent more time at work. Throughout my life, the bottom line that I've worried about most was that my kids were all right. The only rock I know that stays steady, the only institution I know that works, is a family. I was brought up to believe in that, and I do. Brothers and sisters, all families have problems. And all families can be extended families. All families can include neighbors, friends, co-workers, and yes, even strangers. What matters is that we surround ourselves with a group of people who are committed to building those relationships. And people who are seeking to have godly character in their lives. God created us, and God created us in family to be together. I'll leave you with this story. It's an unknown author, but it's been around for quite a while. It's the story of Burned Biscuits. She writes, her mom liked to make breakfast for dinner every now and then. On one night in particular, Mom had worked a long, hard day at work. She came home and made breakfast for dinner. And when she was setting the table, she set a plate in front of her husband, the father of the family, and had eggs and sausage and very burnt biscuits on the plate. And I remember remember sitting there, she says, waiting for my dad to say something. Someone to notice these burnt biscuits on the plate. But as I watched, all my dad did was reach for his biscuit, smile at my mother, and ask how her day was. And then he asked me how my day was, and I really don't remember how we were having this conversation, but I'll never forget what he said. Later that night, I asked him as he was tucking me into bed, I asked him, do you really like burnt biscuits, Dad? And he said, honey, I love burnt biscuits every now and then. Later that night, I was trying to figure it out, and he came back into my room, and I asked him again, and he said, honey, your mom put in a hard day at work, and she's really tired. A little burnt biscuit never hurt anyone. As I grew older and I thought about those times in my life, those times in our lives when we feel imperfect, those times in our lives when we feel like we're not doing enough, those times in our life when we feel like we've fallen short of others or others have fallen short of us. Yes, we all forget birthdays and anniversaries. But if over the years we're able to learn to accept one another's faults, if we choose to celebrate our differences, and we strive and we're committed to being together, that'll be the most important thing we can learn about growing healthy and committed family relationships. Brothers and sisters, being snowed in yesterday probably had some of us on our family stress levels. But may today, by Mark's gospel, may we be able to learn to take the good and the bad, and yes, even the ugly parts of our lives, and leave them all at the feet of God, and let Him take them from us, so that we can be the best that we can be in building these families. Because in the end, God is the only one who can give us the relationships that He created for us. Brothers and sisters, a burnt biscuit isn't a deal breaker. Amen.